The guy leaned against the step of my truck at the 24-hour gas station and said my first name as if he'd known me for years, even though I was absolutely certain I'd never seen that face before. I still had the door slightly open, finishing a coffee I'd bought inside, and the calm way he said it didn't fit the situation. Truck drivers quickly learn to identify people wanting to chat or get money, but this seemed different. He didn't ask for anything, didn't inquire about anything, just mentioned that my last stop had been in Nashville and that I'd probably be driving on I-40 before dawn. At that moment, I still thought it was a guess or a coincidence until he mentioned something that wasn't written anywhere on the truck. That's when the feeling of being watched started to become too heavy to ignore. The gas station where this happened was located on a regular highway exit in Tennessee, one of those places that never closes and is always full of trucks coming and going at any hour of the night. I had stopped there because I still had a few hours before my delivery window, and the place was usually quiet enough to stretch my legs and have coffee. The cargo on that trip was simple: boxes of automotive parts going to a warehouse near Knoxville. Nothing sensitive, nothing that warranted special attention. Even so, as I was parking, I thought I saw a dark sedan slowly driving through the yard before disappearing near the diesel pumps. The clock on the dashboard showed a little after 2 in the morning when I turned off the engine. The air was humid, and the constant noise of compressors and idling trucks filled the entire yard. Some drivers were walking into the store, others were sleeping with the curtains closed. A common road situation, nothing out of the ordinary. But even before I got out, I noticed in the side mirror that same sedan parked 2 rows behind with its headlights off. It didn't seem abandoned because someone was sitting inside. I went into the store, grabbed a coffee, and spent a few minutes watching the activity through the glass windows. Truck drivers learn to observe without looking like they're observing. The sedan remained in the same spot. Nobody got out. Nobody got in. I thought maybe it was some driver waiting for someone to finish refueling. A common situation at large gas stations. Still, when I returned to the truck, I felt that slight hesitation of glancing twice at the parking lot before climbing back into the cab. It was after I turned on the interior light to check the route tablet that I noticed something strange on my phone. It had a notification about an attempted login to an old Root app account that I practically never used anymore. I thought it was odd, but it didn't seem serious either. These notifications pop up occasionally on the road. Even so, I closed the screen and left the phone face down on the dashboard. A few minutes later, while I was still sitting organizing the departure time, I heard footsteps approaching from the driver's side. Slow, unhurried footsteps, stopping right next to the doorstep. Most people knock on the truck or call out from a distance. That person did neither. Just stood there for a second that was far too long before finally speaking. When I looked down and saw the man standing beside the step, the first thing I noticed was that he didn't seem lost or looking for help. He stood there with the composure of someone who knew exactly which truck he wanted to approach in that crowded yard. His face was ordinary, the kind you'd forget a few minutes after seeing. Simple jacket, hands in his pockets, relaxed posture. Yet there was something strange about the way he looked directly into the cab, as if confirming some information before speaking again. He commented that my truck was easy to recognize because of the small company sticker in the corner of the windshield. He said it casually, almost as a compliment, but kept looking at me while he spoke. I replied briefly, trying to keep the conversation light, like any driver does with strangers at truck stops. But instead of walking away, he asked if I still had 2 more hours until the delivery in Knoxville. That wasn't written anywhere on the truck, and at that moment I felt a slight pang in my stomach. The object that caught my attention was the phone in his hand. It wasn't an old model or anything flashy, but the screen was lit and seemed to be showing some kind of map. He didn't try to hide it, nor did he try to show it directly. He just held the device in a relaxed way while talking. When the screen turned slightly towards me for a second, I had the fleeting impression of seeing a blue dot moving on a road. It could have been any navigation app, but the coincidence seemed too great. I thought about simply closing the door and leaving. Large gas stations usually have all sorts of commotion, and nobody wants to be the subject of gossip in the middle of the night. But there was something about that man's calmness that made me hesitate. He wasn't pressuring me. He wasn't trying to climb into the cab. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just talking, as if he were waiting for me to notice something on my own. That's when he mentioned that my truck had passed by a gas station near Nashville shortly before midnight. At that moment, the conversation stopped seeming like a coincidence. I didn't answer immediately. I just kept looking at him, trying to understand where that information could have come from. The yard was still full of trucks running and people walking around, but for some reason it seemed like nobody was paying attention to that short conversation next to my door. And it was exactly in that strange silence that he said the next thing, with the same calm as before. "You usually stop at this gas station when you pass through Tennessee." At that point, the conversation no longer seemed casual, but he continued talking as if it were just a casual road trip comment. He said that drivers end up creating routines without realizing it, especially when they drive similar routes for months. I didn't confirm anything, but he continued observing the interior of the cabin with attention that was too calm for someone who had just arrived. The phone was still in his hand, the screen partially facing upwards, as if he were following something while he spoke. What started to bother me was the accuracy of his observations. He mentioned that I had stopped at that same gas station about 3 weeks earlier, also around 2 in the morning. That could have been a guess based on common driving habits, but the way he put it sounded more like a statement than an assumption. I tried to quickly look around the parking lot, searching for a different camera or someone watching, but everything seemed normal. Trucks running, drivers heading to the store, nothing out of the ordinary. He then commented on something that completely changed the weight of the situation. He said that some people like to track truck routes because it's easy to predict their behavior after a while. It wasn't said as a threat, nor as a warning. It was said almost as a curiosity about logistics. But then he turned the phone a little more towards me. Not enough to show everything, but enough for me to realize that the map displayed had a highlighted route crossing exactly the stretch of highway I had traveled in the last few hours. I asked him directly if he was following me. He replied with a small smile that didn't seem provocative or mocking. He simply said that some information ends up becoming too public when using certain fleet management apps or systems. That didn't make much sense because the company's system wasn't open to just anyone. Even so, the calm way he spoke made it seem like something simple and common. That's when he mentioned something else I hadn't discussed with anyone that night. He said my next stop would probably be a specific rest area before Knoxville, because it was the place most frequented by drivers who arrived too early for deliveries. That wasn't on the GPS at that moment, nor on the tablet. It was just a thought I'd had while driving, and it was at that moment that it became clear that this had gone way beyond the line of a strange gas station conversation. As he continued speaking in that overly calm tone, I began to realize that the problem wasn't the strange conversation anymore, but how long it had been going on without me noticing. Long-haul drivers end up creating predictable routines without realizing it, especially when they drive the same routes for months. But knowing a routine is one thing. Having personal details displayed on a phone screen is something else entirely. Then he fiddled with the device for a second, and the screen turned towards me. My full name was clearly written there. I got out of the truck immediately and stared straight at his phone. He didn't move away or try to hide it too quickly. He just turned the screen around again and said he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He just wanted to show how certain information gets exposed when someone knows how to look properly. The gas station parking lot was still bustling with activity, trucks running and people going into the store, but nobody seemed to be paying attention. That's when another driver walked past behind him, and I took the opportunity to speak loudly, asking why he had my personal information on that phone. His demeanor changed instantly. His change in posture was slight, but enough to realize that the situation had escalated beyond what he expected. He put his phone back in his jacket pocket and said he wasn't doing anything illegal, just showing something anyone could find out with enough time and interest. I was no longer interested in continuing the conversation. By this point, 2 other drivers were watching from a distance, probably because my voice had risen slightly when I asked about the data on the phone. That was enough for the gas station attendant to come out the door and ask if everything was all right. When I mentioned that the man had my personal information on his phone, the situation changed drastically. The employee called the manager, who in turn said he would file a police report because this had already caused problems with other drivers in the parking lot. The man tried to explain something about accessing public data, but ended up being taken inside the store while they called the local police. I waited outside for a few minutes until I realized that this simple stop in the early morning had turned into an official report. At the end of the trip, in addition to the delivery being delayed by a few hours, my name ended up included in the police report of the incident. After the police arrived, they took the man inside the store for a chat while I stayed outside with another gas station employee, noting down some basic information about the truck and the route. It didn't take long for them to discover that he had been seen at other gas stations in the area doing something similar with different drivers. Nothing violent, nothing direct enough to warrant a serious charge, but strange enough to justify a formal report. I finished explaining what had happened, signed the simple report they asked for, and went back to the cab when everything finally calmed down. I left that gas station before dawn, following the highway as planned hours earlier. The cargo arrived at its destination, the day continued normally, and no one at the company paid much attention when I explained the delay. Even so, that same week I deleted some old apps, reviewed all the accounts I used on the road, and stopped disclosing any route details publicly. Because after that early morning in Tennessee, one thing became clear to me. Some people don't need to be inside the truck to know exactly where you are. Before we move on to the next story, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I honestly love seeing how far these stories travel. It's also a huge help for the channel because it signals to YouTube that the content is actually worth sharing with more people. And if you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit the like button too. Alright, let's get into the next one. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a noise or a warning light on the dashboard. It was the strange feeling that the trailer was responding half a second late on a long curve of the Missouri highway. Those who drive heavy trucks learn to recognize the load's behavior almost as an extension of the steering wheel itself. At that moment, it felt like there was a weight shifting differently than normal. I quickly glanced in the mirrors and everything seemed stable behind me. No open doors, no visible swaying. Even so, the feeling persisted, and the more miles I drove, the clearer it became that it wasn't just my imagination. The route that night was straightforward, traversing a long stretch of open highway in Missouri before heading into the next state shortly after dawn. The cargo consisted of industrial equipment packed in large boxes, all secured with internal straps inside the dry trailer. Nothing particularly fragile, but it wasn't light cargo either. I had left the terminal a few hours earlier and everything had been checked normally at the exit gate. Seal applied, documentation signed, and visual inspection done as usual. At least at that moment there was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The early morning hours were calm on the road, with light traffic and few lights besides the trucks scattered along the highway. This type of stretch is usually the most peaceful to drive because there are almost no interruptions. Even so, after a few miles I began to notice small differences in the vehicle's behavior. It wasn't something visible in the mirrors, but the truck seemed to react a little differently when I made adjustments to the steering wheel or reduced speed. Nothing abrupt, nothing that forced me to stop immediately. Just that uncomfortable feeling that the weight in the back wasn't exactly as it should be. I checked the instruments a few times to confirm there were no warnings about pressure, temperature, or any mechanical problems. Everything was normal. The mirrors also showed the trailer aligned as always. Even so, on two longer curves, I again felt that slight delay in the load's reaction. Truck drivers usually rely heavily on this perception because it's what warns them when something starts to go wrong. But at that moment, there was no clear technical sign that justified stopping on the shoulder. That's why I kept driving for a few more miles, trying to figure out if it was just an impression caused by the uneven road. The asphalt in that stretch had some old undulations that sometimes make the vehicle seem heavier than it actually is. Even so, something kept catching my attention. During a simple overtaking maneuver, when I returned to the right lane, the trailer took a little longer than it should have to stabilize behind the truck. That's when I decided to slow down and take a closer look in the side mirrors. The trailer continued to appear normal, doors closed, lights working, no strange movement visible. But at that exact moment, something small finally appeared in the field of vision of the right mirror. Something in the rear door mechanism wasn't exactly in the same position as it usually is during a trip. I slowed down a bit more and started looking more closely in the right mirror. The trailer still seemed aligned and stable, but there was something different about the rear door latch assembly. It wasn't open, it wasn't wobbling, but the small metal arm of the mechanism seemed to be in a position I didn't remember seeing before during the trip. This kind of detail often goes unnoticed by those who don't work with trucks every day, but drivers end up visually memorizing these things after years of looking in the mirror. I continued driving for a few miles, trying to confirm if it was really different or just the angle of the light from the highway. The illumination came mainly from the headlights of the trucks behind and the reflective plates of the trailer itself. Even so, on 2 longer straight stretches, it was possible to see better. The seal that should have been attached to the lock seemed slightly displaced. Not completely broken, but also not exactly as it usually is when it comes straight from the terminal. At that point, I started to wonder if it could have just been road vibration or some poorly done adjustment in the yard before departure. This sometimes happens when the seal isn't perfectly fitted into the locking mechanism. Still, that feeling in the load's behavior kept appearing on the wider curves of the highway. Nothing dangerous at that moment, just a slightly different response that kept coming back. That's when I decided to leave the main lane and look for a wide shoulder a few miles ahead. It wasn't an ideal place for a full inspection, but it would be enough to quickly check the trailer doors. As I signaled the lane change, another truck slowly passed on the left and its headlights illuminated the rear of my trailer directly for a second, and it was at that moment that the detail I was trying to understand finally became clear in the mirror. The seal was still there, but its position indicated something that shouldn't happen without someone directly tampering with the lock. I pulled over to the wide shoulder a few miles later and got out with the small flashlight I always keep behind the seat. Traffic on the highway continued as normal, trucks speeding by, and the wind displaced by the vehicles gently shaking the parked trailer. I walked to the back, trying to confirm what I had seen in the mirror. The first thing I noticed was that the doors were properly closed. No visible openings, no loose latches. Even so, when I brought the flashlight close to the mechanism, the strange detail immediately became apparent. The seal was present, but it clearly wasn't the same one that had been placed at the terminal. To someone looking quickly, it might go unnoticed, but those who work with cargo learn to identify these small differences. The number engraved on the seal didn't match the one on the shipping document. Furthermore, its attachment to the mechanism seemed rushed, as if someone had resealed it after opening it. This raised 2 bad possibilities at the same time. Either someone had tampered with the cargo during a previous stop without me noticing, or the problem had started even before I left the terminal. Neither situation was good for whoever is responsible for the transport. Even so, at that moment, the doors were closed and there was no visible sign of external tampering, other than that detail on the seal. While I was still examining the lock with the flashlight, a car slowly passed by on the highway and slowed down for a few seconds before continuing on its way. It didn't seem interested in stopping, but the situation was starting to get uncomfortable there on the dark shoulder. I went back to the cab wondering if I should drive to a better-lit gas station to check the load more thoroughly. It was then, as I started moving again and re-entered the right lane, that I felt that same strange response from the trailer. Only this time it was stronger than before, as if something inside had actually shifted position during the stop. As soon as I got back on the highway and the truck picked up speed again, the difference in the load's behavior became impossible to ignore. The trailer seemed to react with a greater delay in slight turns and steering corrections. It wasn't something that showed up in the mirrors, but it was clearly felt throughout the entire vehicle. Heavy trucks transmit this kind of thing through the seat, the steering wheel, and even the noise of the suspension. At that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just an impression caused by the road. A few miles later, I had to slow down because of a construction area that narrowed the road. When I applied the engine brake and let the truck decelerate, the trailer responded with a slight internal movement that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't a strong jolt, but it was enough to realize that something inside had moved incorrectly. That explained the strange sensation on the curves. The weight of the load was no longer exactly where it should be. It was at that moment that I understood the problem wasn't just the tampered seal. Someone had probably opened the trailer at some point along the way and tampered with the boxes inside. Maybe trying to remove something, maybe just searching. The result was that part of the load was now misaligned. And even without an accident, that already meant one thing for sure when I arrived at my destination. The damage had already been done. I decided to continue to the first large gas station I came across to check the situation more calmly. Driving on the shoulder wasn't safe, and opening the trailer in the darkness of the highway didn't seem like a good idea either. I maintained a lower speed than normal and drove a few miles observing the behavior of the vehicle. On each long curve, I could feel the internal weight responding erratically. It didn't completely compromise the steering, but it made it clear that something inside the trailer was no longer properly secured. When I finally entered the well-lit parking lot of the gas station, I parked away from the pumps and went straight to check the rear doors again. The tampered seal was still there, confirming that someone had tampered with the cargo at some point along the route. I carefully opened the doors and illuminated the interior with my flashlight. Several large boxes were leaning against the side wall of the trailer, and 2 tie-down straps had been removed. It didn't look like complete cargo theft, but clearly someone had gotten in there and moved things around enough to compromise the weight distribution. I spent almost 40 minutes reorganizing what I could alone inside the trailer before closing the doors again. Even so, some boxes were already crushed and some of the merchandise had been damaged by the movement during the trip. I notified the company in the early morning and continued the journey after I managed to minimally stabilize the load. When the delivery was checked at the destination, what I had suspected since stopping on the shoulder was confirmed. Some of the material was no longer usable. The financial loss was recorded in my trip report. After delivery, warehouse personnel checked the entire load before completely unloading the trailer. Some boxes were merely misplaced, but others had been compressed by the weight during the miles traveled due to the incorrect distribution. The supervisor noted everything in the report and took some photos to send to the carrier's insurance department. No one raised their voice or made a direct accusation, but it was clear that something had happened at some point along the route before arrival. The company asked me to report exactly when I noticed the strange behavior of the trailer and on which stretch of highway I made the first stop. They also asked about the tampered seal because the number didn't match what was on the original cargo document. This kind of thing goes into an internal investigation and usually takes weeks to fully clarify. For me, at that moment, all that remained was to accurately record everything and move on to the next shipment. Since then, one thing has changed in my road trip routine. Whenever I stop to refuel or rest, I do a quick check of the trailer locks and seals before returning to the cab. It may seem like a small detail, but that morning in Missouri, it only took someone fiddling with the tailgate for a few minutes to turn an ordinary trip into a loss report. On the road, sometimes the problem doesn't appear when it happens. It only starts to be felt miles later. I was starting to line up the truck to back into the dock when a man appeared out of nowhere, knocking twice on the cab door and showing a DOT badge as if the inspection was mandatory at that very moment. The problem is, this was happening inside a private industrial area in New Jersey, not at a weigh station or inspection checkpoint. Even so, he spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. He said he needed to quickly check documentation and a few things on the trailer before I continued the maneuver. At first it seemed like just roadside bureaucracy, but within seconds, details began to emerge that didn't match any real inspection I had ever seen. That morning's delivery was to a large industrial area in northern New Jersey, one of those regions full of logistics warehouses, narrow truck lanes, and a constant flow of trucks coming and going. I had arrived a little before the scheduled time and was waiting for dock instructions while organizing the cargo papers on the panel. The yard wasn't exactly quiet, but it wasn't crowded either. 2 trucks were maneuvering ahead, and a forklift was passing near one of the warehouse doors. The cargo was simple. Pallets of packaged components coming from the Midwest, destined for smaller deliveries. Nothing sensitive, nothing requiring special inspection. The normal procedure there was to enter the gate, register the dock number, and wait for a signal from the warehouse employee. I was already starting to line up the truck for the maneuver when the man appeared, walking across the yard wearing a reflective vest and a name tag around his neck. At first it didn't seem strange. Large industrial areas usually have inspectors, security, or warehouse staff circulating in the yard. He walked with a firm step and looked directly at the truck as he approached. When he got close to the cab, he knocked twice on the door and raised his badge quickly enough to show only the large letters, DOT. Even so, one small thing caught my attention right away. Actual DOT inspections rarely begin in the middle of a maneuver on private property. especially without a patrol car, cones, or any other officer nearby. Still, I opened the window slightly to hear what he wanted, because sometimes companies hire internal inspections or audits that follow similar rules. That's when he asked for my transport documents and said he needed to do a quick check on the truck before I parked at the dock. While he was talking, he was already looking at the back of the trailer as if he were looking for something specific back there. I was still partially aligned with the truck for the loading dock when he repeated that he needed to see the documents before I could complete the maneuver. His manner of speaking was direct, without much explanation, as if it were standard procedure. Even so, there were small things that didn't add up. He didn't ask me to turn off the engine, didn't ask me to engage the parking brake, and didn't mention an inspection number. He simply held out his hand, expecting the papers. As I reached for the folder on the dashboard, I took a closer look at the badge he was wearing around his neck. The large letters did indeed say DOT, but the rest of the information seemed too generic for an official document. I couldn't read his agent number or state identification. Furthermore, his reflective vest was completely ordinary, the kind anyone buys at a hardware store. Still, he maintained a calm demeanor, as if he were used to drivers handing over their documents without question. The object that caught my attention the most at that moment was a small clipboard he held in his other hand. There was no official form attached to it, just a folded sheet of paper with some loose notes. Real inspections usually have long lists, codes, and specific fields. This looked more like an improvised list than any kind of technical document. I handed him only the cargo manifest through the window, keeping the rest of the documents with me. He glanced quickly at the paper but didn't seem truly interested in the information there. Instead, he turned and looked again at the back of the trailer, as if assessing something he hadn't yet properly examined. That's when he said he needed to check the inside of the trailer before unloading, because he had received information about irregularities in loads arriving in that industrial area. The way he spoke seemed rehearsed, but the procedure simply didn't make sense for that type of delivery. When he mentioned that he needed to check the inside of the trailer before unloading, something started to become clearer in my head. Real inspections rarely require the immediate opening of cargo inside a private yard without the presence of a warehouse manager. Even so, he continued to act as if this were normal procedure. He took 2 steps toward the back of the truck and looked at the trailer doors as if he were already expecting me to get out and open them. As he walked behind the truck, I took a closer look around. The industrial yard continued to operate normally. Forklifts crisscrossing between warehouses and 2 other trucks waiting to dock a few yards ahead. Neither of them appeared to be undergoing any inspection. There was also no official vehicle, no inspection pickup truck nor any other agent circulating there. I got out of the cab more to observe than to cooperate at that moment. He was already standing behind the trailer, looking directly at the door seal. His posture changed slightly when he realized I wasn't immediately opening the lock. Instead, he asked if that seal had been placed on the originating terminal. The question itself was common, but the way he phrased it seemed more interested in the seal than in any formal verification. That's when I noticed another detail that didn't add up. He didn't try to check the seal number against any document, nor did he ask to see the rest of the cargo paperwork. He just observed the door mechanism like someone trying to figure out how to open it quickly. It no longer seemed like an inspection. I was still standing next to the trailer when a warehouse employee appeared, walking from the other side of the yard toward the docks. It was at that moment that the attitude of the man with the name tag began to subtly change. As the warehouse employee began to approach the docks, the man with the badge glanced at him for a second. It was a small reaction, but enough to realize that this wasn't part of any official procedure. If it were truly a DOT inspection, the presence of someone from the warehouse wouldn't make any difference. Even so, he shifted his position slightly and looked back at me as if trying to speed things up. He then asked me again to open the trailer for a quick check. This time his tone wasn't as confident as before. I replied that any inspection there would need to be done with the warehouse manager present or with an official vehicle in attendance. As soon as I mentioned that, his expression changed almost immediately. It wasn't visible nervousness, but the confidence he had shown just minutes before simply vanished. That's when I realized he was still holding the clipboard, but without really looking at it. It seemed more like an accessory than part of any real work. As the warehouse employee continued approaching across the yard, the man with the name tag quickly tucked away the folded paper that was attached to it and took 2 steps back, moving away from the trailer door. At that point, it was already clear that the inspection had never actually taken place. The curious detail is that he didn't argue, didn't insist, and didn't try to explain anything. He simply looked one more time at the door seal as if confirming something, turned his body, and began walking in the opposite direction from the courtyard. And that's when it became clear that it wasn't just a misunderstanding during an inspection. He was simply leaving too quickly for someone who, minutes before, had said he was conducting an official inspection. The warehouse employee approached me a few seconds later and asked if I was having trouble maneuvering at the dock. I discreetly pointed to the man who was already walking away across the yard and asked if he worked there or if he was part of some scheduled inspection. The employee looked in the same direction for a few seconds and replied that he had never seen that man before. He also commented that DOT inspections never took place in that yard without prior notice to the warehouse management. While we were talking, the man was almost reaching the side exit of the industrial area. There was no police car, no official truck waiting, and no one seemed to be accompanying him. He simply crossed the yard like any ordinary visitor and disappeared behind one of the warehouses. This confirmed what had already been clear since he avoided speaking to the warehouse employee. The dock supervisor quickly reported the incident to the company's internal controls. They said they had heard similar stories at other logistics centers in the region, mainly involving people trying to access cargo before the official unloading. There was no pursuit or police call at that moment because the man had already left when they realized what was happening. After that, I finished the maneuver, aligned the truck at the dock, and followed the normal delivery procedure. The cargo was unloaded without any problem, and the seal remained intact until the warehouse itself opened its doors. Even so, that approach in the yard made it clear that someone was interested in seeing the inside of the trailer before the official unloading. And in that kind of situation, the most important detail isn't what the person says they are. It's the moment they realize someone else is getting closer. After the unloading was complete, the warehouse supervisor commented that this type of approach had been happening in some industrial yards in the region. Nothing too aggressive, just people trying to impersonate inspectors or employees to gain quick access to the inside of trailers before the cargo officially entered the warehouse system. It wasn't always a direct attempt at theft. Sometimes they were just looking for a specific type of merchandise. Before leaving the yard, I checked the trailer doors again and verified the seal that had already been removed during unloading. Everything was exactly as it should be. Even so, that situation had shown how someone can try to take advantage of ordinary moments in the delivery routine. A dock maneuver, a few seconds of conversation, and a generic badge were almost enough to turn it into a fake inspection. When I left that industrial area in New Jersey and got back on the highway, one thing had already changed in my driving routine. Whenever someone shows up claiming to be an inspector outside of a weigh station or without an official vehicle nearby, I don't open any trailer until I have clear confirmation of who is speaking. On the road, those who work with cargo learn to recognize many things by instinct. Sometimes the only sign that something is wrong is someone's haste to look inside your trailer. That's all for today. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around. Before you head out, please leave a comment with your location and the current time. I read through these to see who else is awake in the quiet hours, and it's the best way to help the channel grow. It tells the algorithm that our community is active, which helps YouTube push these stories to new listeners. A quick like on your way out is always appreciated too. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.